It's good to see Jim and Lily and Martin. Thank you very much for hosting us here tonight and for your sponsorship. And I'm delighted to be here to talk about this issue. But before I talk about anything serious, I want to talk about my favorite magazine, which is called The Funny Times. It's Funny Times, distributed over here in the UK. It's a wonderful magazine. It's a monthly compendium of humor. And they get, I think it's mainly US. They get humor from around the US. They publish it every month. And they have some regular features. And one of my favorite features is obvious headlines. And they gather headlines that were really published in real newspapers, and you just can't believe that anybody actually was paid to do this. And a couple of months ago, they had one that had the following: man killed, police suspect homicide. How's that? Police raid gun shop, find weapons. Larger kangaroos jump farther, study finds. Somebody got paid a lot of money for that. My favorite, prostate cancer more common in men. An Islamic center has Muslim ties. Okay. So these are some real obvious headlines. You know, I've been working on these energy issues for a long time, and over the course of the past 5 years, I noticed some other obvious headlines like oil prices reach record highs. It's astounding to think, even back in the context of 5 years ago, that we would be at $100 a barrel oil with newspaper articles about whether or not we might dip below $90 a barrel. Or another obvious headline has been record temperatures. World temperatures reach record high. In the United States, we have had more than 250 record temperatures in cities around the country in just the past couple of years. We have record droughts and record rainfalls. It's happening all over the world. And another obvious headline, sadly, has been US troops sent off to the Persian Gulf. We've had 2 foreign wars in the Persian Gulf in the past 2 decades in the United States. The reasons are complex, but it is no accident that our troops are being sent to the region of the world that has half of the world's oil reserves. So as I started to think about these issues and these obvious headlines and how they stitch together, oil was is a plain underlying factor. And I also have been paying enough attention to the US political scene for a while to start to see some potential political opportunity. And for me, it was crystallized in a moment about 18 months ago as I was starting to write this book, when I had lunch in Washington with Newt Gingrich, who, as many of you may know, was leader of the Republican Revolution in the 1990s, far right-wing guy. And he was at Brookings Institution, where I work, with about 30 people, answering questions on a wide range of topics. And whatever you think about Gingrich's politics, and I mostly disagree with Newt Gingrich, he's a brilliant guy. He was answering questions on his diverse array of topics, had 6 points on absolutely every item, very cogent, well thought out. And so I was starting to write a book on this. I said, what should we do about the problem of oil dependence? And within a few weeks, I had dinner with Howard Dean, who's the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and also a brilliant guy. Same type of setting, about 30 people. People were firing questions at him on a wide range of topics, and I said, Mr. Dean, what should we do about the problem of oil dependence? And Newt Gingrich and Howard Dean gave me basically the same answers to that question. And they are not identical twins, let me tell you. But both of those guys said oil dependence is a huge national security problem that we must address as a matter of priority. But both of them said ethanol is a big part of the answer, and I want to come back to the ethanol question. Both of them said we need a huge research project, a Manhattan project, an Apollo project to help solve this problem. And both of them, including Gingrich, said we need the fuel efficiency of our cars to improve. And so for me, this was a bit of an aha moment. And I thought, if Gingrich and Dean more or less agree on major elements of this problem, maybe there's a moment of political opportunity here. And I knew enough about technology to think that we have a moment of technological opportunity also. And so that kind of set me off on the research on this book. So what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the book and kind of my conclusions, how I come to them, and then turn a little bit to climate change politics in the United States, where I think we really have some dramatic and interesting developments. And I want to talk about that and then answer any questions that you all have. Ian said a little bit about the format of the book. I'll say a few more words about that. I did a proposal for this book, which McGraw-Hill bought very quickly, and I was starting to write it. And I turned in the kind of first chapter of this book, and my editor called me up and said, you know, David, this is a really boring book you're writing. They'd already bought the book. He said, if you're going to write a book like this, why don't you just do it with Brookings Institution Press or an academic press? You know, you'll have a kind of targeted academic audience, which is fine. But you told me when we started talking that you're looking for a broader audience. And so can you think of some way to make it kind of more accessible to a general audience? And so I thought back and kicked around a few ideas, and I decided to do what Ian said, which is write this as a series of of memos among the President of the United States top aides. And this drew for me upon my experience in the White House in the 1990s. I worked on the National Security Council staff and the staff of our Council for Environmental Quality. And a White House aide has a number of responsibilities. I mean, one of them, which is most in the kind of front of the public mind, I think, is advising the President and Vice President kind of on a day-to-day basis when they're working on an issue you're working on. But in many ways, the more fundamental role is coordinating the viewpoints of different federal agencies. And you know, in the United, we have dozens of federal agencies working on a wide range of topics, and they often disagree, as they should. I mean, the EPA will have the Environmental Protection Agency will have a different view than the Department of Commerce, than the Department of Agriculture on some question. And so a White House aide's job is to bring these views together, resolve them when it's possible to resolve them, and if it's not, to frame the issue for the President for decision. And my portfolio was global environment and energy issues, and I would call meetings on some topics and 2 or 3 agencies would come. It's what I would call a meeting on global warming. The whole government showed up. It was unbelievable. I mean, everybody had an interest with this issue, the possible exception of the Department of Veterans Affairs. But I mean, everybody, it's quite astounding. So I spent a lot of time as part of the climate change process kind of synthesizing different agencies' viewpoints, and then these big issues were teed up to Clinton for decision. And so this book kind of does it. It starts with a memo from the President to his or her top aides saying, I'm going to give a speech in a month on the topic of oil dependence, which I think is one of the most important issues out there. What should it say? And then the National Security Advisor writes back with an explanation of why it's a big national security issue. And the Environmental Protection Agency writes back why it's a big environmental issue. And we talk, an economic advisor talks about the economic issues, and then there's a series of solutions that different people write in. And there's disagreement, just as there would be in the government. People say, hold it, you forgot the most important issue, and then it's all wrapped up at the end with a big speech by the President. And then, you can't write a book that just has policy memos. In fact, one of my reviews, my favorite review of all the reviews I've gotten, somebody said, even though it's a series of policy memos, it's actually a pretty interesting book. You can't just write policy memos, and so I also tell the story of a dozen Americans who are working on this issue throughout the course of the book, and I use the device of saying, the President is going to talk about 12 people in his speech or her speech. Who should the President talk about? Because it's the device our President often uses. I don't know if PM does it here, but talk about some point and then recognize somebody in the crowd who's working on this issue. I mean, and really for me, one of the really fun parts of the book was not just digging into the documentary record, but also taking trips and talking to people and talking to leaders who are working on this issue. I mean, one of the interesting ones was actually General Richard Zillmer, who was the commander of U.S. forces out in western Iraq until about a year ago. And he got out there to Al-Anbar province about 3 years ago, and he looked around and he said, I am losing more men and women in diesel fuel convoys than for any other purpose. Shipping diesel fuel back and forth to Al-Anbar to power our generators out here. And he said, I'm in a desert with lots of sun and lots of wind. Why are we generating electricity here with diesel fuel? And he put in a priority 1 request to the Pentagon for combat-ready renewable energy resources. They were able to respond in part, but not fully. And so, I mean, the Pentagon is actually now kind of mobilized in some ways in renewable energy production. And there's some interesting connections here with the development of the internet, and the internet, which had some development, partly comes from work within the U.S. defense establishment. And I think the U.S. defense establishment may be able to mobilize to help with this issue as well. So what were the main conclusions from a policy standpoint? The first most important conclusion I came to in looking at the question of how do we end oil dependence is that the problem of oil dependence is principally a problem of our vehicle fleet. The core problem here is that 96% of the energy in our cars and trucks comes from petroleum, from this one substance. And if I am thirsty, which I am, and I don't feel like water, I can have orange juice or Coca-Colas. If I'm hungry and I don't feel like pasta, I can have fish or vegetables. if I want to travel any significant distance in most places in the world and I don't want to use petroleum, I'm basically out of luck. Maybe if I'm not going too far, I can ride a bicycle. A lot of bicycles in this town, which is wonderful. There's some electric trains in some cities and some places in the world, but basically, we have a global transportation infrastructure that is utterly dependent on this one commodity. And it seems normal to us. I mean, I grew up with this. We all grew up with this. Our parents grew up with it. Our grandparents grew up with it. But I think it is fundamentally not normal to have an entire infrastructure on which the world depends so dependent on this one commodity. This is a more important issue in my view. It's a more fundamental issue than the problem of import dependence. And in the US at least, the entire political dialogue too often focuses around energy independence and about which the public kind of really doesn't know exactly what they mean often, but it's kind of this resource nationalism which takes place kind of everywhere in the world. And I often say, I can actually point to the UK and I say, in the year 2000 or so in the UK, truckers went on strike here because of rising diesel fuel prices, right? Now, at the time, the UK was energy independent. You were exporting oil and gas out into the world markets, right? And in a way that I think probably people in this room may understand, but many people more broadly do not, the level of import dependence is not closely related to the price that consumers pay for petroleum products and markets. And but the key issue here is the overwhelming dependence of our cars and trucks on this one commodity, which gives overwhelming influence to producers of it, which has significant environmental implications and has implications for drivers. I mean, essentially, when the price of oil goes up, you've got two choices. You either pay more or drive less. I mean, that's it. And you don't, unlike other commodities, and this, of course, affects the elasticity of demand for the product, there are no readily available substitutes. So, conclusion number one, this is fundamentally a problem of the dependence of our cars and trucks on oil. Conclusion number two, to solve this problem, the single most powerful tool we have is building cars that connect to the electric grid. The most important solution out there is making cars that would connect to the electric grid. In the US, though we have 96% of our energy in our vehicles are from oil, only 3% of the energy in our electric sector comes from oil. And it's true in most countries, most developed countries. We don't use oil by and large for electricity production. We really have two distinct markets. We have a liquid fuels market and an electricity market. If we want to get off of oil, using the electric infrastructure is the most potent tool. We have this vast infrastructure for generating and distributing electricity in developed countries with outlets that reach into basically every home and business. It does us actually very little good in terms of getting off of oil because our cars and trucks can't connect to it. You often hear people say we need solar and wind power to help us get off of oil. And there are lots of good reasons to use solar and wind. And people often say we need nuclear power to help us get off of oil. Those statements are only true if we have cars that connect to the electric grid or cars that connect to the electricity that those technologies generate. We're not going to drive cars with windmills on top in all likelihood, and we're not going to drive cars with little nuclear generators in them. Those technologies can be useful, but we need to build cars that connect to the electric grid. Now, so let me talk about electric cars. The biggest development in automotive technology in the past 5 years has been hybrid engines, and it's going to be the most transformational technology I think in auto fleet for the next decade or more. And anyone here drive hybrid cars? Is that a few? So the basic idea of a hybrid car is it is a combination of an internal combustion engine which uses gasoline or diesel, uses petroleum like the cars you've been driving your entire life, and an electric motor. And the electric motor has a battery that's recharged in a very creative way by capturing energy in the brakes or waste heat, other types of waste energy from the engine. And it helps to improve gasoline mileage. There are 1 million hybrids out on the world roads today. They're climbing dramatically. In the United States now, General Motors has has hybrid engines out in 8 or 9 different models. And there's some very interesting analysis done suggesting that the petroleum consumption projections out of the IEA and other mainstream sources are significantly off for failure to reflect the likely penetration of hybrid engines in the vehicle fleet over the course of the next decade. But the key is these hybrid engines that are out there right now do not connect to the electric grid. You can't plug them in. Those of you who drive them know they're kind of recharged as you go along by your petroleum engine. The key next technology is to get cars that can be plugged in. And so the good news is, one, these are coming, and two, I've been driving one of these around all fall in Washington, D.C. It's been great. What I've got is a Toyota Prius that has the spare tire taken out and a big lithium-ion battery put in, and a plug. And lithium, it's not heavy. Lithium is the third lightest element, the lightest metal. I go home every night. I plug the car into my garage. I get about 30 miles on a charge. And like most Americans, at least, I drive less than 30 miles every day back and forth to work, so I basically never use petroleum. The way this car is designed, if I go up a hill or if I accelerate quickly out of a stoplight, it will use a little bit of petroleum for a little bit of power. And it's got this great little gauge on it that simultaneously calculates your miles per gallon. I was driving around for like a week, and I called the company and I said I'm getting about 80 or 90 miles a gallon, which is a really, is a good figure, very, very high mileage. And the company said, "That's ridiculous. What do you mean? We get much better than 80 or 90 miles a gallon." And they came in, they showed me how to kind of ride the hills and this type of thing. And then you can get really competitive about this. So I went out of my house and turned right. I would go downhill for like a half a mile, and I could ride it, and I would get 2,999 miles per gallon, is where I capped out on the gauge there. And then I would go up a little hill, and it would plummet all the way down to 150. But this is a great technology. General Motors has announced that they're coming out, they're investing in this in a big way. This is one of the stories I tell in the book is about a woman named Chelsea Sexton, who's the star of the movie Who Killed the Electric Car, which I recommend you seeing. And it's all about General Motors and what they did 10 years ago on this. They have come full circle. And I was recently at a public event with Chelsea Sexton when she was asked, "Do you think General Motors is serious about their commitment here?" And she said, "Absolutely. There's no question about it. They're investing a lot. They say they're going to have a car called the Chevy Volt, which is a plug-in hybrid, out in the year 2010. And I think it's potentially revolutionary. Actually, I grew up in the state of Michigan, which is kind of automotive capital in the United States, and the communities around where I grew up have been devastated by kind of the lack of leadership in the American car industry over the course of the past quarter century. And the American car industry has really missed the boat, putting out these big gas-guzzling products. And I think they're finally starting to catch on that there's consumer demand for products that get good mileage. And I am not a scientific sample, my experience, but I will say driving around the streets of Washington, D.C. in this car, because this is a demo car, it had these big gaudy decals that said plug-in hybrid. People would stop me on the streets of Washington, D.C. and say, "Can we trade?" like that. The enthusiasm for these cars is pretty significant, I think, in some quarters. So I think plug-in hybrids are a big part of the answer. A critical question here with plug-in hybrids is, so what's the impact on global warming? Because the energy has to come from somewhere, right, when you plug it into a grid. And in the United States, 50% of our energy comes from coal. And so is plugging into a coal plant a good idea? And the great news is that the answer is yes. Even when you plug an electric car directly into a coal plant, you produce fewer greenhouse gases than running your average US car on oil. And the reason is that electric motors are so much more efficient than those internal combustion engines we've been driving our entire life. If you think about it, those internal combustion engine, you drive it around for a couple of miles, it gets too hot to touch. And we have radiators and radiator systems that are entirely designed to dissipate waste heat from these cars. The thermal efficiency of an internal combustion engine is roughly 20%. Thermal efficiency of even a pulverized coal plant is like an old-fashioned pulverized coal plant, like 30 or 33%. So even plugging cars into coal plants directly is basically a wash. If you plug a car into a grid that's half coal, it's a big win. And the real win is plugging these cars into renewable energy sources. In the central United States, for example, we have very significant wind resources. But I was down in Texas a few months ago talking about this to a utility manager who said, we've got lots of wind down here, but my basic problem is that it mainly blows at night. And I don't need electricity at night because the electric loads are about, on average, 60% at night what they are during the day. And we don't have storage systems in our utility sector, right? We don't have big batteries at power plants. That could come, by the way, but we don't have those right now. So basically, utilities just produce power and it flows. So plug-in hybrids are a great solution to that problem. You can imagine 100,000 million people going home in a city and plugging in their car at night, recharging the battery with wind power, basically, and driving during the day on the wind power. And they could recharge at the offices during the day with solar power. So plug-in hybrids are a great technology. The principal barrier is battery cost, and that's coming down. I think, like other technologies, it will come down with high volume. So a second conclusion, which I've gone on at length about, is plug-ins. Let me talk about 3 other solutions more quickly, and then I can answer questions in more detail. Second are biofuels. And it's very interesting. When I started writing this book about 2 years ago, there was this ethanol euphoria. Everybody I talked to was in favor of ethanol in different ways. As I've been talking about this in the past 3 or 4 months, I get many more skeptical questions and critical questions about biofuels than I do supportive questions. The pendulum has really swung, and I think for good reason. I am a cautious supporter of biofuels. The key statement when it comes to biofuels is not all biofuels are created equal. It depends what you make it out of. And to start with ethanol, if you make ethanol out of corn, the environmental footprint is dramatically different than if you make it out of switchgrass or other so-called cellulosic sources or from sugar. And in the United States today, we mainly make ethanol from corn. And I've dug into the literature on this last year, particularly on the greenhouse gas implications. And the literature as it existed last year suggested that corn-based ethanol was probably a 10 or 20% improvement over gasoline from a greenhouse gas standpoint. Actually, just in the past month, there's been new research released in Science which suggests that it's not that good. That if you look at life cycle implications of corn-based ethanol and other biofuels, that the equation is worse. So it's a slight positive, maybe roughly a wash from a greenhouse gas standpoint. In order to make corn in large quantities, fertilizer is dumped on fields, and that has big nitrate runoff issues, so there's water quality problems. So there's concerns. I think corn-based ethanol is largely a transitional fuel towards ethanol made out of other products. And you can make ethanol out of cellulosic sources like switchgrass and fast-growing trees and forest residue from logging operations. The technology is very well known. It's not economic at this point. And one of the people I talked to, I relate in this book, is Vinod Khosla, who's the leading venture capitalist in this area. And he made about $1 billion in Sun Microsystems and other IT in the 1980s. And he's now a huge investor in this space. And he told me, first time I met him, we're going to be completely off of gasoline in 25 years. We're only going to be using cellulosic ethanol. I thought, that's interesting. And he's made a certain credibility from his business success. And I went back and read the literature on this. And I went back to him later and said, I've not read the literature. And this is like wildly, you're at the wild end of the spectrum here to think we're going to completely replace gasoline in 25 years. And he said to me, well, look, he said, I've got 3 $50 million bets down on different technologies here for converting cellulose to sugar and then making it into ethanol. And I know a couple dozen other people who have scale, bets at about that scale. And in my experience, with all this money, with all this attention and energy kind of going into the sector, we're going to see dramatic technological breakthroughs, and I think the cost is going to plummet. So I don't know if he's right, but he's been right before. If we see just a fraction of that, we're going to see big developments in this sector, and the ecological footprint of producing ethanol from these sources is much, much different than producing it from food grains. And so I think that offers some amount of hope. By the way, another trip I took in this was to a racetrack. The Indianapolis 500, which is a big racing league we have in the United States, is being run this year entirely on ethanol. Ethanol is a high-octane fuel. You can race cars very fast on ethanol. And I'd been to some of these races, kind of stock races as a kid, but I really hadn't been to any of these as an adult. And so I went down to talk to this guy who won. His name is Buddy Rice. He won the Indianapolis 500 in 2004. And now he's a big ethanol proponent. And I went to one of these races, and I remembered as I went there, 2 things. It's the incredible sound. If you've ever been to one of these races, it is so loud, you absolutely can't talk. You have people, it's like, have to communicate by sign language. And then the smell of gasoline is really strong. And so I went to the racetrack, and the sound was just like it always was, and it smells like a bakery. You know, it's unbelievable. They're burning sugar as they race around that track, and you know, it's amazing. And these guys are all very enthusiastic about biofuels. I'll go more quickly over two other critical pieces of the puzzle here, I think, in terms of oil dependence. One of them is simply just improving the fuel efficiency of our vehicles. Whatever fuel we use, making cars consume less energy. And there are many opportunities here with lightweight materials, with good studies that there's technologies that are not generally deployed in engines that make a big difference. Diesel engines are coming to the United States, by the way. I mean, they're obviously very big in Europe. In the United States, we have been unwilling to accept the high particulates and soot out of diesel fuel that has been tolerated in Europe for the past generation, and so we haven't had a large penetration of diesels in our vehicle fleet, but we now have low sulfur diesel fuel regulations and improved diesel engines, so that diesel engines are going to make a big breakthrough, I think, in the United States over the course of the next decade, and they're more fuel efficient. They save about 30% in terms of fuel efficiency as compared to gasoline engines. Another piece of this that I learned a little bit about writing the book was with trucking fleets. I mean, if you wanted to design a vehicle that had bad aerodynamic drag and therefore wasted energy, you'd have a hard time doing a better job than these big box trucks that you see out on kind of American highways, at least I don't know about here. And it's amazing to me that this has persisted. And there's interesting, actually, retrofit technologies that some companies, I think you see these on highways, companies are throwing on little things that help to improve the aerodynamic drag on some of these box trucks, and new trucks are going to be made in ways that help to save fuel. And then finally, a critical part of the solution here is mass transit and new urban planning and telecommuting plans. And the telecommuting piece was one thing that I learned about writing this book. I hadn't realized kind of some of the data on this is really astonishing, that companies that have strong telecommuting plans have happier workers and more productive workers. And obviously you save a lot of fuel if you're not driving back and forth to work, and there's good data on that. In the U.S. at least, we do not have a level playing field for mass transit. I mean, it's really astonishing. If you're a state or local government and you want to get money for a road, and it's widening a road, you don't have to prove as much, and you get a higher reimbursement rate than if you're putting in a proposal for a mass transit project. It's absolutely backwards from the way it should be. And we need a level playing field at a minimum for mass transit, which would help to reorient development patterns. And by the way, we know, traffic engineers know that widening roads does not solve traffic problems, but there's often political pressure to do just that. I mean, it's a pretty well-established phenomenon. You widen a road that has endemic or congestion, and a year later, you still have the congestion, you just have more cars on it. People have adjusted their driving patterns to come back onto the road. I found somebody who said that widening roads to solve traffic problems is like widening your belt to lose weight. So it's the same basic concept. And yet we persist in this folly of kind of widening roads, and it promotes the car culture. So we need to change these patterns. And one other story here, I talked to this real estate developer in the American city of Phoenix, which is this huge, vast, sprawling city in Arizona. And he said he built a subdivision of about 120 homes that was designed around this revolutionary idea. Get this, people could actually walk from their home to the soccer field. And they could walk from their home to the grocery store, which is something you generally can't do in Phoenix, Arizona. And he said he had 120 homes. He had more than 1,000 people come. He thought that the overwhelming demand for this. He said, but the basic problem is that, I mean, he can do this in a subdivision, but then people still need to drive 45 miles to work or whatever, so there's only so much that any one developer can do. But I think this is a big part of the solution to the problem as well. So I think the big parts of the solution here are plug-in cars, biofuels cautiously with attention to ecological impacts and poverty and food price impacts, fuel efficiency, and mass transit. There are two pieces of the puzzle here that I am not enthusiastic or about less enthusiastic. The first is hydrogen, and hydrogen for our fleets. I'm not opposed to hydrogen technology by any means. I just haven't seen anything that convinces me that it's got a lot of potential to affect our vehicle fleets. The basic problem is, there are really two problems. One of them is getting the hydrogen in large quantity. And hydrogen is it's the most common element in the universe, right? But there are no underground caverns of hydrogen. Hydrogen is a common element, but it only exists bound into the molecules of compounds like water or natural gas or oil or coal that you need to separate it from. And separating the hydrogen from those other molecules like H2O takes energy, and it takes money. And so getting the hydrogen is going to be expensive or polluting or both. And it's a big challenge how you actually get hydrogen in large volumes. And then once you get the hydrogen, the question is, how do you distribute it? Hydrogen turns to a liquid at, I think it's about 36 degrees above absolute zero. And so you're not going to use the liquid distribution infrastructure that we have to distribute hydrogen. And unlike electricity, where we have an infrastructure that reaches into every home, we don't have an infrastructure like that for distributing hydrogen. So I don't see how we're going to get from here to there. I think with hydrogen in our vehicles, there are some niche applications such as municipal fleets or airport vans or that type of thing where you can have a common refueling station where I think hydrogen has got potential. But by and large, I don't think it's got huge potential. I have to say, I said this to some automotive engineers who have pushed back and said they think it's got more potential than I've said. I'm certainly, I'd love to be convinced, because hydrogen, if you do it right, can be a non-polluting technology. A second way of addressing this problem that I'm actually quite concerned about is liquid coal. Coal obviously exists in nature as a solid. It can be converted into a liquid and burned as a liquid fuel in vehicles. The Germans did this during World War II because they didn't have access to oil and they did have access to coal. South Africans did this during the apartheid regime because they were being embargoed. And it's a well-known technology. It's an expensive technology, but the biggest concern about it is its impact on global warming. If you do that, you generate roughly twice the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of energy as you do from oil. So, I mean, it's going in the wrong direction from a global warming standpoint to substitute liquid coal for oil. It's like cutting pasta out of your diet and replacing it with chocolate cake or something like that. I mean, in the United States, partly because of this energy independence push and because we have lots of coal, there is some political push to use our coal resources, turn them into liquid, and use them in our vehicles. And that is the wrong direction to go in terms of the global warming problem. So just a few words about global warming, then I'll answer some questions. And what's happening in the United States, because I think there's some very exciting developments. I mean, I should say as a premise that in my opinion, global warming is one of the two kind of existential threats that we face right now. I mean, it's as a people, and the other being kind of nuclear non-proliferation. There's no threat more important than global warming. And to say that my country's record of leadership on this issue has been lacking would be an understatement. Let me say that. I mean, I was in government until January 20th, 2001, at noon, roughly. As George Bush was raising his right hand, and I joined the loyal opposition. But the good news is here that there are only the next president of the United States will be one of three people. Next president of the United States is either going to be Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or John McCain. And the good news is that all three of them are very strong advocates for action on global warming. John McCain, who is going to be the Republican nominee, was the principal sponsor of our legislation in the U.S. Senate to cap carbon emissions over the past 5 years. Big break with lots of his Republican allies over this issue. The McCain-Lieberman bill was the principal vehicle here. And he has been very, very strong on this. And Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are quite strong as well. So I think we're going to change the dynamic in the White House, for sure. In the U.S. Senate, which you need 60 votes to get anything passed in the U.S. Senate, we already have 54 or 55 votes for this legislation. I think that it's definitely only going to go up in the next round of elections. And I think this is going to happen in 2009, 2010. I've been saying I will say, I've probably said in a dozen different speeches in the United States in the past couple of months, if anybody in the audience would like to make me an even money bet, I will bet you that we will have federal cap-and-trade legislation in 2009 or 2010. And nobody yet has come up to take that even money bet. I think it's going to happen. But I will also say this. I think the momentum towards this is considerable. I think the degree of difficulty is high. I mean, if you kind of rated legislation like you do Olympic dives, you know, with 10 being the highest degree of difficulty, this is a 10. I mean, full stop. It's like you can't imagine. And those of you who, if anybody in this room has been involved in some of the discussions over the ETS, the emissions trading system in Europe, you have some flavor of this. I mean, this is highly complex, and in particular, the value of the permits that are being created here is unbelievable. I mean, in the United States, what we will do is require permits for the emission of roughly 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which is about 80% of what we emit. And the price of those permits will depend upon the level of stringency, but people are talking about roughly $20 a ton. Let's just say, take that figure. So $20 a ton times 5 billion tons, we're talking $100 billion of permits are being created here. And they can either be auctioned, sold, like the spectrum is in many places, or given away to people who feel that they deserve it or have political power. And the scrum on Capitol Hill over this is going to be extraordinary. I mean, so this is going to be kind of an epic battle, I think. But I think the momentum is considerable, and I think we will see such legislation in 2009, 2010. You know, even as we've had a vacuum in Washington on this issue, there has been dramatic movement in global warming in the United States. I've never seen an issue move as quickly politically. It's astonishing. I mean, it's reflected most dramatically in California, you know, which has now passed binding cap-and-trade legislation, the state of California, and is moving forward to implement it. Republican governor, obviously, Arnold Schwarzenegger. I talked to the Republican governor of the state of Florida, the successor to Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother. And he was elected for the first time last year, which was a very democratic year in the United States. And he told me, he said, the reason that I was elected as a Republican in a 50-50 state in a democratic year was my strong stance on environmental protection. He was strong on this, and he's been strong in moving his state towards global warming action. And we've seen, I mean, big businesses in the United States, such as General Electric and Walmart, are moving aggressively in this direction. Al Gore's movie had a tremendous impact. I mean, I'm not completely objective on this, having worked for him, and he's a hero of mine. But the movie has had huge, you know, impact. In particular, I think it's focused people's attention on this issue who wouldn't have paid attention otherwise. People who were maybe predisposed towards thinking this is an issue but had never paid that much attention to it. It's really kind of grabbed people by the lapel and said, this is something you've got to pay attention to. So I think we're seeing dramatic action on this, and you know, I'm pretty encouraged that we're going to take some important steps. A critical piece of the whole equation, obviously, is China, and figuring out how to handle that. And so actually, let me close. I'll close with two stories. First about it, I was just in China. I hadn't been in China in 5 years, and kind of like every China traveler, you know, kind of, I was amazed at what's going on there. I mean, I'm sure people here have been, you know, some people recently to China. I mean, I mean, the level of infrastructure development and I mean, it's first class. It's astonishing. And I gave a lecture at Tsinghua University, and I took a taxi by the Olympic developments. And for some reason this day, by the way, the air was crystal clear in Beijing. I've never been in Beijing before this week. I mean, it was where the air was clear. I mean, I've been in Tiananmen Square before where you can't see across, you know, 100 yards because the air is like pea soup. But I think it rained heavily the day I got there, and then it was very windy, and people were speculating that maybe they had turned off some of the factories as a test run for the Olympics. I don't know whether that's true, but it's possible. But the air was crystal clear. Went by this, and I mean, it looked like, you know, Canary Wharf, or I mean, you know, it's unbelievable, or you know, it's kind of, or Orange County in the United States. I mean, the level of, you know, new buildings and absolutely extraordinary. And I got to the airport, and I wanted to change out of my suit to get into travel clothes, and I only had like one bag, so I wanted to do that before I checked my bag, so I had to go to this exterior bathroom to change, and I was saying, oh God, this is going to be disgusting. And I went in, and it's like this beautiful, big, new bathroom. I felt like it was in some private locker room. And then I was whisked through customs incredibly efficiently in Beijing airport, and I got on the 13-hour nonstop flight from Beijing to Washington Dulles Airport. And I got out of the plane at Washington Dulles Airport. 350 people in line, 3 customs agents, right? In the public sector that we have defunded as a matter of policy in the United States over the course of the past 20 or 25 years. And then I waited in a 35-minute line, and I got out and went to the bathroom in the luggage area, which was small and hadn't been cleaned in a day. And I was thinking kind of, who's the rising power here? Which is a bit of a digression to say, if you're thinking about the global warming issue, China is a critical part of the solution. We can talk about that. So my favorite trip as a whole in writing this book was actually not to Beijing, but to the city of Reynolds, Indiana, which is a small town in northern Indiana, center of the United States, about 547 people, and Republican part of northern Indiana, and they have decided they want to be completely off of fossil fuels this time. They want to only use renewable energy. And it's not that easy for a little town of 547 people to do this type of transformation. But they're in the middle of the Corn Belt, and so they got an ethanol company to give them ethanol, or to build ethanol facility, and for commercial sale. And they converted the one pump in town to an ethanol pump. And they got General Motors to give them some cars that will take both ethanol and gasoline. And they're well on the way to having a transport sector that uses only renewable fuels. And then they turn to the electricity sector, and they're a hog town. They have 100,000 hogs, and the waste has been a problem forever from a water pollution, groundwater standpoint. So they built an electricity plant that will burn waste and help them kind of get off of the grid, the coal-based grid out there. And the head of the town council said to me, talked to me, said, the problem here is not technology. The problem is getting people to believe in something that's never happened before. And I thought that was actually pretty good insight. And in this whole area, the core problem is getting people to believe in something that's never happened before. And on my way back to the airport, I had rented for the first time a GPS, Global Positioning System box. It's like a little bit more than a year ago now, 15 months or something. I rented it for $10 a day from Hertz, and it was sitting next to me in the empty passenger seat and telling me in the soothing female voice, turn left 50 in 5 miles, turn right in 50 feet. And so this is like so cool, and I went home and I told my teenage kids about this, and they were laughing at me and saying, Dad, like all of our friends' parents have had these in their cars forever. This is like not that new of a technology, and they weren't that impressed by it. But I was thinking, when I was their age, we definitely didn't have little boxes that talked to you and told you to turn left in 50 feet. But it's not just that, it's that I'd never even had the idea of a box like that. I'm quite sure the thought never occurred to me. And if it did, I would have dismissed it as wildly futuristic. And so, I wondered, so what is it that my teenage kids will say the same thing about when they're my age? What will they look back on and they'll say, back in 2008, we didn't even have the idea of a technology like this. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think with all of the energy, all the attention, all the money, all the effort that's going into this whole clean energy area, we're going to see some real breakthrough technologies, and I think we will be free of oil, and I think we will solve the climate change problem. So thank you very much. Delighted to be here and happy to answer any questions.